I've been looking for, excuse me, more or less compact treatment of what we've discussed already, putting together, sort of organizing all the moving parts of this International Assassination Bureau. In past articles, of course, we've talked about the black nobility, and we've talked about the Nazi International, we've talked about the hidden elements within British Secret Service that coordinated with the KGB in the early days. We've talked about, Geneva, the central role of Geneva. We've talked about François Genot, the one who was primarily the financier of the Nazi International. Many of these things we've talked about we've alluded to the Synarchists. I don't know if we've really drilled down, but I was quite excited to find this review of a book. This is from 2004. This is Executive Intelligence Review, 4th of February 2005. The book came out in 2004, and this is a review of that book, but an excellent overview of this whole apparatus, this International Assassination Bureau, and its stated intention, basically summarized, would be the war against the sovereign nation state, the war that is waged by the black nobility, by the Synarchists, by the finance oligarchs, mostly centered in Venice and Geneva. And this review kind of satisfies, or will answer many of our questions as to how all of this fits together. So let's just dive in at this point. Italy's Black Prince, Terror War Against the Nation State by Alan Douglas. The Black Prince and the Sea Devils, the story of Valerio Borghese and the elite units of the Decima Mas by Jack Green and Alessandro Massignani. Da Capo Press, 2004. The career of the Roman Black Prince, Junio Valerio Borghese, gruesomely illustrates how virtually all modern international terrorism and all assassinations of heads of state and government, such as President John F. Kennedy, former Italian minister Aldo Moro, or the numerous attempts on France's President Charles de Gaulle, derive from the post-war Nazi International sponsored by the Anglo-American-led Synarchy and its intelligence services. To trace all the ramifications of that career is to open a door onto the centuries-old highest level of the financial oligarchy, the Synarchy, the aristocratic families of the black nobility, the sovereign military order of the Knights of Malta, and the heirs of what Pope John Paul I called the Ancients of Venice. The fascist Borghese founded Mussolini's elite naval warfare squadron, which he turned into a savage irregular warfare unit in northern Italy by the end of World War II. Picked up by Alan Dulles, James Jesus Angleton, and other anti-FDR operatives of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, Borghese and his men would be involved in every major post-war coup attempt or terrorist outbreak in Italy until 1970, when he fled to Spain after the failed coup attempt most closely associated with his name. From Italy, and then while in Spain, he maintained connections all over Europe and with the bloody Operation Condor, torture and murder syndicate in Ibero-America. An examination of Borghese's career enables one to peer beneath the surface of terrorism and spectacular assassinations into the netherworld whence these actions are launched, where international high finance, ancient aristocratic families, pro-fascist elements of the Curia of the Catholic Church, leading fascists of the Hitler-Mussolini era and the Anglo-American intelligence services, in particular those of NATO, are all unified in a war against the modern nation state. The British and the US intelligence services files on Borghese are still classified, as are the Borghese family archives in the Vatican after 1922, when Mussolini seized power. For those of probably no one who's listening to this, but for those who might believe that these ancient families are somehow irrelevant today, I would say take note of little things like that. The present book is the first biography of Borghese in English. When correlated with other recent exposés of Gladio, the post-World War II NATO stay-behind network in Europe, and when all are situated within the work of Lyndon LaRouche and his associates on the Synarchy, it is a notable contribution to unmasking international terrorism, though the book's authors are perhaps not always aware of the full implications of what they present. And that could be partly because LaRouche's team is really absolutely the best in terms of organizing and contextualizing everything from every possible angle. So it's not surprising, and that's certainly no slight to those authors or their contribution. Borghese belonged to a principal family in Rome's ostensibly Catholic black nobility. As we talked about previously, the black nobility, those that sided with the Pope during the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, they were not siding with the Pope out of some devout Catholicism, but out of the prestige and the power that they derived from the financial being essentially associated with bankers to the Pope. Borghese belonged to a principal family of Rome's ostensibly Catholic black nobility, many members of which, if you want to take a screenshot of that and look into these notes, many members of which, there he is, claim descent from the elite of the Roman Empire. Numerous popes and cardinals came from the Borghese and allied families, such as the Pallavicini, the Colonna, and the Orsini. These families maintained enormous power into the 20th century and still today, as of 2005, and even still today. In the Curia, the administration of the Vatican, their faction within the church helped construct the infamous rat line, run in part through monasteries and convents, which spirited thousands of fascists and Nazis out of Europe after the war into Ibero-America, Asia, and the Middle East. Whether the Borgheses indeed originated with the Roman Empire, as they claim, or only rose in the early 16th century, as records suggest, they could boast of one pope, Paul V, Camillo Borghese, reigned 1605 to 1621, and several cardinals, while a Borghese prince married Napoleon's sister. They lost their fortune in the 19th century, and thus the 20th century saw Junio Valerio Borghese going to war, which is something normally a son of a family of that status would never have done. In the first half of the book, naval warfare specialists Green and Massignani recount the development of Italian naval irregular warfare on the eve of World War II, which involved light craft, frogmen, and sabotage. Borghese was an innovator in this field, beginning with his sabotage efforts for Franco during the Spanish Civil War of the late 1930s. He founded Mussolini's naval special warfare unit, the Decima Mas, commonly known as the X-Mas, MAS was originally an acronym for Motoscafi Antisommergibili, Motoscafi Antisommergibili, anti-submarine motorboats, but soon became the generic term for any light craft. The Ex-Mas was a kind of personal squadron of Italy's Venice-centered oligarchy, staffed by officers from leading noble families. One of them was the nephew of Italy's royal house of Savoy, Prince Aimone of Savoy, the Duke of Aosta. The Ex-Mas thus mirrored the oligarchical coloring of the OSS, where the leadership was so dominated by blue bloods, such as Wall Street's pro-fascist Alan Dulles, that it earned the sobriquet "Oh So Social." The two organizations were destined to collaborate closely. Its aristocratic pedigree enabled the Ex-Mas to operate as largely independent from Mussolini. As Green and Massignani note, quote, key personnel inside the Ex-Mas were of noble stock, and this enabled them to win the support of top-level officers. It also made it possible for them to be in direct contact with the companies that supplied and developed craft, new weapons, and equipment for the flotilla. So there again, we see hints that support my claim that even today these families are on top and call the shots and probably are responsible for what I think seems to baffle so many of us, myself included, is the twists and turns and the inconsistencies in what we see, the new alignments forming and the strange turns of events that we see. It's because, in my view, you have these families behind the scenes plotting against one another and organizing various narratives, various schemes. We're seeing them. We don't actually see down to that level. We see the surface of the water, so to speak. Anyway, going on. Soon after taking power in mid-1943, the new royalist Italian government signed an armistice with the Allies. The royalists captured Mussolini in July and held him in a remote prison in the Apennine Mountains. He was freed in a daring raid, so the story goes, led by Hitler's chief commando, Otto Skorzeny, who was later to become, like Borghese, a kingpin of post-war international terrorism. The Nazis disbanded Italy's army and sank most of its navy so that they could not be used against them, but some diehards, notably Borghese and his Ex-Mas, chose to fight on for fascism. Many other Italians were organized by Italy's political parties, including the Communist Party, into partisan warfare bands, which fought both the Germans and Mussolini's 1943 to 1945 Nazi-run Rump Salo Republic in northern Italy. Hitler's henchman for the German occupation of northern Italy, SS General Karl Wolff, formerly Himmler's private secretary, ordered Borghese and his Ex-Mas to move on to land, where they became infamous for anti-partisan warfare, including the systematic use of torture and the summary execution of Italian civilians as a lesson to the partisans. Green and Massignani report that in the 600 days of the Salo Republic, the Ex-Mas raised a force of 50,000 men, and that in the bloody civil war which followed the armistice, probably more Italians died than in the entire war before then. The Ex-Mas was nominally committed to the Salo Republic. However, it never swore allegiance to Salo and never flew any flag but its own. Reports flooded back again. Like I read this and I want to know what's going on at the aristocratic, at the level of nobility, that these things are happening the way that they do. And that's really the goal of what I'm trying to do, is to get to gain some insight, maybe gain some particulars. I don't know how much I can hope for at this point, but we keep drilling down, right? Reports flooded back to Mussolini that Borghese was maintaining contact with all sides. So Il Duce had Borghese arrested in early 1944, though he soon released him. Indeed, Borghese had either established contact or worked with the SS Security Service, Sicherheitsdienst, with which he worked closely, the Abwehr, German Army counterintelligence, the Italian Royalist government, British Secret Service Intelligence Service, British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, James Jesus Angleton, chief of the OSS counter-espionage branch in Italy, and Alan Dulles, OSS, Bern, Switzerland, station chief. He also met several times with SS General Wolf. Wolf and Dulles plotted the Anglo-American redeployment of fascist operatives after the war, among them Borghese. Indeed, Wolf declared, where the person of Borghese, quote, when the person of Borghese and his Decima Mas is concerned, I have spoken several times with a representative of Mr. Dulles, unquote. In late 1944, Rome's black aristocracy asked the Allied military governor in Italy, Vice Admiral Ellery Stone, to intervene in favor of the terrible boy Junio Valerio, a friend of the Borghese family and lover of a Roman baroness. Stone needed little convincing. As the partisans closed in on Borghese in May 1945, Stone instructed Angleton to warn him, which the latter did personally. On May 19th, the Americans formally arrested Borghese, thus saving him from a scheduled execution by a partisan firing squad. A brief hiatus. The Americans and the British showed a keen interest in the ex-Mas wartime activities, especially its Vega battalion, which had operated behind enemy lines. As one ex-Mas leader put it, foreshadowing Borghese's later deployment as part of Gladio, quote, for the Allies, we were important because we had infiltrated the communist bands. We knew their secrets and tactics and therefore developed the first anti-guerrilla procedures. They wanted to know how we carried out the anti-communist war. They wanted to exploit our knowledge, unquote. The Germans had also developed stay-behind units to function behind Allied lines in Italy, and the ex-Mas were almost certainly part of that operation as well. Several members of the ex-Mas were taken to the United States for debriefing. Borghese's friends in high places ensured that the Allies would clear him of war crimes. The Italian government, however, demanded that the Allies hand him over for trial in Milan in late 1945. His friends again intervened, and his trial was transferred to Rome, where Dulles, Angleton et al. Had ensured that many of the old fascist bureaucrats remained in office, and where the courts were much more conservative. After 2 years in prison, he was finally found guilty in early 1949 of collaborating with the Nazis, though not in war crimes, and sentenced to 12 years in prison. As one frustrated observer put it, quote, the crimes of Borghese's band were too obvious and the verdict had to be life imprisonment. But the court, through a scandalous application of extenuating circumstances, pardons and remissions, reduced the sentence, unquote. The judge then decided he had served enough time and released him, an action that would have been politically impossible before Britain's Winston Churchill announced the beginning of the Cold War with his 1946 Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. Borghese's new career was about to begin. A universal fascist. Shortly after his release from prison, Borghese became president of the Italian Social Movement, MSI party, composed largely of former fascists. The MSI was a mixture of national and international universal fascists. Borghese was committed to the latter outlook, which today is openly espoused by neocon Michael Ledeen, himself a protege of a Mussolini cabinet minister, the Venetian oligarch Vittorio Cini. Cini, in turn, was a key collaborator of maybe you've heard of the Cini Foundation, which supposedly is the most powerful think tank in the world, or was until recently. Cini, in turn, was a key collaborator of the real architect of Mussolini's regime, its longtime finance minister, the Venetian Count Giuseppe Volpi di Misurata, very central figure to the Synarchy. Green and Massignani describe Borghese's universal fascism and its plans for a Europe free of nation-states, but unified under NATO. Quote, fascism in the post-war era was different from its pre-war variety. Although it had splintered into many different factions, it had two powerful drives. One was that it was anti-communist. It was this element that made Borghese acceptable to the mainstream parties and national secret services. He was ultimately pro-NATO, as was the rest of this wing of fascism. The other one was the realization that in the post-war environment, no single European nation could stand up to the two superpowers, and hence that Europe would be a third force. That is, Europe would be opposed to the twin imperialisms of international communism and international finance capitalism, both of which were perceived as being materialistic, exploitative, dehumanizing. Emphasis in original. And you're probably thinking, as I am, I mean, that this is kind of fascinating, this last quotation here. When one thinks about the situation today with NATO and Europe in shambles, and yet this overweening, oppressive NATO agenda that seems to be threatening to extinguish Europe, and yet one can't tell if it's trying, a last gasp effort to consolidate Europe as a viable security arrangement, or whether its mission is suicidal, in which case I would think that probably you have still great influence on the part of the British Crown and CIA. But it's fascinating to just, stop and just read this quote again in its historical context, and think about the situation we're in today. Borghese's United Europe was the scheme promoted from the early 1920s on by his promoted from the 1920s on by his fellow oligarch, the Venetian Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi of the Kalergi Plan, which became, there's Michael Ledeen, which became an explicit goal of the Synarchist International in the 1920s and 1930s. Today, the seed crystal of that united Europe has become the Maastricht Treaty-generated European Union and its European Central Bank. The same vision of a united Europe had also inspired Hjalmar Schacht, the financial architect of Hitler's regime, though Schacht viewed Hitler's conquest of Europe as the pathway to achieve it. It was also the vision for which the Synarchy, as the early architects of Bolshevism and the Soviet Union, there was the world domination was the goal, and we see this very very hidden connections between British SIS and KGB, going back this far, going back to the 20s, because of this, the common agenda of one worldism. Is almost like a perverse hyper focus on this goal. It was also the vision for which the Synarchy deployed one of its most notorious agents of the 20th century, Alexander Helfand Parvis. Parvis first financed the Bolshevik Revolution, and then, after it was victorious, became the most ferocious anti-Bolshevik, proclaiming that only a united Europe could stop the communist menace. Between the wars, this united Europe scheme was momentarily eclipsed by the national fascisms of Mussolini, Salazar, Franco, and Hitler, though all were installed by the same Europe-based, London-centered Synarchy. But after the war, write Green and Massignani, Borghese's universal fascism was the wave of the future, as well as the incubator of international terrorism. In Italy, this is a quote, in Italy, it was the fascist faction that possessed the many international ties that stretched between Franco's Spain, South America, and South Africa. It was from this faction, too, that many of the acts of terrorism of the Black International sprung. NATO, gladio, which means sword in Italian, and international terrorism. Post-war Italian politics may appear to be a wilderness of mirrors, with its rapid changes of government, multiple coup attempts, and spectacular outbreaks of terrorism. Going back to the Nazi occupation of northern Italy during World War II, however, to examine the various British, American, and Nazi actors and their respective ties to different Italian factions, the reality quickly becomes apparent that the Anglo-American Synarchists merely replaced and to a great extent subsumed the Nazis and Mussolini's fascists as the would-be fascist occupying power, locked in mortal struggle against those Italian patriots, both conservatives of the Christian democracy and leftists of the Italian Communist Party, who wished to establish a sovereign Italy. The battle for a sovereign Italy centered on economic policy. In 1950, forces around wartime partisan leader, later industrialist Enrico Mattei, effected a radical shift within the ruling Christian democracy away from free market policies towards a dirigistic program of rapid industrial growth, with an extraordinary series of state-sponsored corporations and projects such as the Cassa per il Mezzogiorno, Southern Italy Development Fund, based on the model of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt's Tennessee Valley Authority. Italy experienced an economic miracle with annual growth of over 7% for almost a decade. A linchpin of this was the newly founded national oil company, ENI, which Mattei headed in a war for energy independence against the Synarchist Seven Sisters. Wow, that's a lot to digest there. That's fascinating stuff. That's the war on the sovereign nation state encapsulated in modern times. Enraged at Italy's developing sovereignty, the Anglo-Americans deployed terrorism and assassinations to stop it. Borghese's activities run like a black dye through all of this history until he fled to Spain in 1970. Let us now examine a scene in which he was to be so prominent an actor. I think this is a good place to stop because it ends on such a strong note and gives us so much to think about. And we'll continue next time with more. Of course, I encourage everyone to download this article. And in the meantime, be well, and till soon.